made off of fundamental data. The balance sheet, cash flow, the P&L. They get this information off the 10Qs and the 10Ks, the financial statements that are filed with the SEC. And it's FASB that sets up all those rules about how if you're going to determine whether or not an expense is an R&D expense or an SG&A expense or cost of goods expense, or whether it just goes on the cash flow statement or whether it also goes on the P&L and the balance sheet. All these rules are developed by FASB. They developed what's called GAAP, which is the generally accepted accounting principles. And then, of course, you have U.S. GAAP, you have international GAAP, and I think there are a few other GAAPs out there. I don't know if we have Singaporean GAAP, but there are lots of different GAAPs out there. And one of the things that the SROs now are doing is trying to do harmonization, right? So we have different forms of GAAP. The hope is that some number of decades forward, we will have one form of GAAP. Okay. So as far as the organizations that run the securities industry, we have the major ones are Congress. Congress passes laws. Then we have the SEC. The SEC passes rules which interpret those laws, right? And then we have self-regulatory organizations that have very specific laws, oral role in licensing and making sure that people are aware of the laws so that they can practice in a responsible manner in the securities industry. Okay? So let's go off for a moment and talk about blue sky laws. Blue sky laws refer to state laws in the United States that regulate the financial services industry. There are 50 states, and there are close to 50 different laws in each one of the states govern the securities industry. A lot of this is simply due to the fact that the states were in there first. Like a lot of things in American history, the states are sort of the incubator of ideas. The first blue sky law was passed in the early 1900s. 19 is what we have now. And I'm sure as soon as Kansas did it, the neighboring states wanted to do it, and all of a sudden you ended up with a whole bunch of different laws. And obviously that's not easy to comply with. If you want to raise money and you want to go out to the people in the United States, if you have different laws in different states, it can get very costly. Very good for lawyers, very good for accountants, not very good for people who are raising money. So that is one of the reasons why the federal government stepped in with the Securities Act of 1933. A little bit of an effort of harmonizing U.S. laws on how you raise money, and there have been some specific laws passed since there as part of an effort to harmonize the U.S. laws. And the primary vehicle for harmonizing the state laws, or the so-called blue sky laws, has been what is called the Uniform Securities Act. Okay, if you take a look, there are actually, I think this law was passed 3 different times. So you'll pass it, and then more laws will creep up, or there'll be more ideas about how to harmonize. You'll pass it again. So we had it first in 1956, then in 1985, then in 2002. I'm quite sure that we'll have another one come out in the future, because as you go forward, states keep passing laws, right, and the federal government keeps trying to get them harmonized. And this had been one of the big advantages of the United States over, for example, Europe or Asia, is that we do have more of a common market, right? So that you can access 300 million people by simply filing a financial statement with the SEC. You can't necessarily do that in Asia. If you want to raise money in Singapore, you want to raise money in Hong Kong, and you want to raise money in Tokyo, you got 3 different regulatory organizations, right? In the U.S., you can raise money in Dallas, San Francisco, and New York, and just have one regulatory agency to work with. However, you do have to be careful because those are 3 different states, and you've got to go through and take a look at the different blue sky laws. Okay? So, as we move forward, we move on to the Securities Act of 1933, and this really was the first of the federal pieces of legislation. Okay? And the Securities Act of 1933 was passed at a time in this country when people were very worried about the marketplace. The stock market had crashed. A lot of people lost a lot of money. And it was just a political time in this country when people were looking for the government for help, as opposed to, say, a period in like 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected, where people were viewing the government as part of the problem. In the early 1930s, when FDR was elected, people were looking at the government for answers. Okay? And they wanted the government to get involved in regulating the markets. And there was a lot of tension, because historically there were 2 big seats of power when it comes to financial services. New York, and one has been Washington. Politicians always like to regulate, and markets, as a general rule, don't like to be told what to do. And so there was a big clash back in the early 1930s. It's really from the collapse of 1929. And so the markets, had fallen quite a bit and really hadn't rebounded. And FDR got elected, and it was one of his first acts as president was to get the Securities Act of 1933 through Congress. And there was a lot of gnashing of teeth. A lot of people on Wall Street did not like this. It wasn't as easy back then to make the threat of, oh well, we'll just take our business to London or Hong Kong. But there were a lot of people who just weren't going to play along, right? I mean, there's always the opt-out of you don't comply with the law, and there was a lot of threats going back and forth. So what happened is that there was a guy who came down from Washington who was the father of the current Senator Kennedy. Joseph Kennedy came down from Wall Street, and he was the first commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Okay, and one of the things that he did was that he came down and he made one ironclad rule, and that was that the SEC would just be responsible for distributing facts, not opinions. And that's a key thing to understand about the SEC. Any prospectus that you see, any document issued by the SEC as part of a securities offering, makes it very clear that the Securities and Exchange Commission does not tell you whether or not this is a good or a bad investment. Instead, what the Securities and Exchange Commission is supposed to do is require the companies in their documents to put forth all material information, all relevant facts. Okay? And at the time, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who summed up the regulatory philosophy by saying that sunlight was the best disinfectant. Okay? In other words, as long as everyone's playing with the same information, then everyone has the same ability to make money or lose money, right? The perception at the time, which of course had some validity to it, was that the men in smoke-filled rooms on Wall Street knew what was going on, and that the suckers up in the Bronx who were investing the money that they were supposed to be spending on milk to bring home to the family, they were the last in the information chain, and they bought it just before it crashed, right? There's a famous old story about J.P. Morgan, who went to get a shoe shine, and he was sitting there getting his shoes shined by a little boy, and a little boy started giving him stock tips. And J.P. Morgan decided that if his shoe shine boy was giving him stock tips, that the markets were overbought, and he was going to sell all the stock. And that was in the late 1920s. And there was, I think, a real problem there with the insiders knowing what was going on, and the outsider being the everyday man, just kind of buying on rumor and suspicion. And this is something that the Securities Act of 1933 wanted to prevent. So they are big on what is called anti-fraud. Okay? If there is a contract between the company that's going public and another company that's not revealed, all right, that can get you in big trouble. If your financial numbers aren't good, that will get you in trouble. If the CFO of the company is also his brother is CFO or CEO of a competitive company, it's got to be disclosed. All right. So the Securities Act of 1933 is also known as the Truth in Securities Act. Was all about getting